Right, good evening everyone. I think we'll make a start on tonight's webinar, which is part of our series on widening participation. We've got another double bill for you tonight. I am going to talk about making reasonable adjustment, and then my colleague Lauren is going to take over and talk about inclusion in a more general sense. We're both going to talk for about 20 minutes or so, and there'll be a chance for people to raise questions or make comments afterwards. My name's Owen. I am the UK Projects Manager. I work overseeing lots of our development work. I am mostly at the moment working on our development project in the Eastern region, funded by the YIF project, as well as overseeing our work in Scotland, developing and consolidating our existing groups, funded through the NVOSF project, which has also supported this webinar series. So as I said, my theme is about reasonable adjustment, which is a phrase that I'm sure people have heard, and is kind of relevant to our work as we talk about how to include children and young people in our work. Just to give you a quick overview of where I think we're going this evening, I'm going to talk about some of the key principles, and particularly the legislation, the 2010 Equality Act, which is where this concept of reasonable adjustment is defined in law. Some people may have come across what we call the GLEESON case, which was a recent example which has possibly some implications for the way that we work and the way that we consider our duty to make a reasonable adjustment. Having outlined reasonable adjustment, I'm then going to talk about what adjustment might look like and also what might and might not be reasonable. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to make that happen in reality and some of the issues around sharing information that will crop up as well. And I'll just share some tips and possible resources towards the end. So to look at the key principles, regardless of any legal duty, I would hope and expect that Woodcraft groups would be seeking to be as inclusive as they can of all young people who want to be part of Woodcraft folk, because if we're not doing that, and if we're not making every effort to make our groups open and inclusive, then we might as well shut up shop and go home. But this notion of reasonable adjustment talks about a particular responsibility that we've got, that derives from the 2010 Equality Act, and that defines some instances fairly loosely in which we might want to think about changing things that we do to include some children and young people, or to ensure that they could be included. You don't have to wait for people to come along and demand that you make a reasonable adjustment before you do it. It's excellent to reflect on your practice and go, do you know what, if we ever want to be better at including children and young people, perhaps this is a change that we should make. So the 2010 Act defines a number of protected characteristics, and these are the things that are protected in law as those things that we should seek not to discriminate against. This will be a list that's familiar to many of you. When we're talking about the concept of reasonable adjustment, though, that is a concept that's enshrined in the Act purely in terms of disability. We have a responsibility in law to make reasonable adjustment to include people with disabilities as defined in the Act. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't seek to make adjustment to, for example, ensure that our group activities were accessible to people from a particular religion, belief, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and generally be nice and inclusive of everybody who comes our way. But the particular issue that we're talking about tonight of reasonable adjustment is a concept that relates in the Act specifically around disability. And that's defined as having a mental or physical impairment that has a substantial and long-term effect on people's ability to carry out day-to-day activities. That's a pretty broad definition in law, and it is the definition of disability that is enshrined in UK equalities law. That obviously encompasses people with physical or sensory disabilities like deafness or visual impairment, but it can also include people with impairments like being on the autistic spectrum, or people who have got dyslexia or dyspraxia to an extent that it has a substantial and long-term effect on their day-to-day activity. So it's a fairly broad definition, and therefore I think I would err on the side of treating our responsibility to make reasonable adjustment as being pretty broad. Last year there was a case which I think got a lot of us thinking and reflecting on the situations that we put ourselves in, and that was the GLEESON case. This lad here is Ben GLEESON. He is a young man who has autism. He was a member of a Cub Scout group. He had been a member of Beavers perfectly happily. And when he moved up into the Cub Scout group, suddenly the leaders of that group felt that there were issues around including him in the group, and required that he was supervised on a one-to-one basis when he was participating in activities. And his parents, who just happened both to be solicitors, pursued legal action against the group and received an out-of-court settlement of a number of thousands of pounds for them breaching their responsibility to make reasonable adjustment. Their argument was that the nature of his condition didn't warrant one-to-one supervision, and that was excessive, and that effectively, because that had to be provided by them or not at all, effectively breached his right to be part of the group. It was further complicated by the fact that the group had communicated with other parents of children in the group about this young man and his disability without their consent. They then, interestingly, got extensive media coverage about that, and his photograph was everywhere. But make of that what you will. I think the thing to recognise in here is that it was not a case that went to court. It was settled out of court, and therefore there's not case law that derives from this. But the idea that actually we are, to some extent, putting ourselves in a position where we could be open to an accusation that we were failing to fulfil our duties, our legal requirements under the Act, even as volunteer youth leaders, is, I think, something it's worth us all reflecting on when we ask ourselves the question about, are we doing the best that we can do to make our activities inclusive to young people with impairments, whether they are physical, sensory, or whether they're learning disabilities or conditions such as autism, which affect how a child will be in a group. It's obvious that young people with a wide range of sensory or communication difficulties could get an awful lot out of being part of Woodcraft Folk, and therefore we need to seek to make sure that we can do that as effectively as possible. So adjustment then could mean doing almost anything differently. We might move ourselves to a more accessible venue. It might mean that we adapt some of the activities that we do to make them more accessible physically or emotionally to young people in the group. Or it might mean that there's some games that we just don't play anymore. It might mean that we say maybe we need a higher adult-child ratio, either every session, because there are children who need much closer support and supervision to engage positively in the group, or There might be particular activities where we want to have more adults on hand. If, for example, we're going outside or we're doing an activity that needs that requires people doing things for the first time, we might need to seek additional volunteers to do that and maybe give them a specific brief about supporting and helping to include particular children who have particular issues that we need to address. It might mean, under some circumstances, that we provide a choice of activities so that people who find one thing difficult can have something else that they can engage with, or there's an opportunity for them to have time out or a change of scene. It might mean that the group guidelines or how we manage behaviour in the group is changed to accommodate specific needs. It might mean that we have to spend more time focusing on how we communicate with the young people, being very direct, being very clear, not using kind of, lots of metaphors and things that we know people with autistic spectrum disorders, for example, can find very challenging to get their head round. It might mean that we ask our volunteers who are going to be supporting a group to undertake additional training, either to skill them up more generally, or to go and acquire some particular expertise or skills. For example, going on a BSL course or going on a course to understand how to accommodate some particular medical need or to guide a young person with sight impairment, for example. So those are some of the ways in which we might look to adjust our activities. But I think the key is about what's reasonable. And I suppose a better way of looking at it is to think about what reasonable isn't. A reasonable adjustment will never be one that means we ask more of our volunteers than they're willing and able to offer, leading to volunteers saying, actually, do you know what, we're not up for this, we're not up for the demands that are being placed on us. Because if we do that, if we put volunteers in a place where they feel that they're no longer able to volunteer because they can't meet the expectations that are placed on them, then actually that will impair everybody's ability to access the group, because the group ultimately will close. It's not reasonable to change our provision in such a way to include a young person that our aims and principles are completely compromised, or that we fundamentally change the nature of the provision in some way. To go back to that example about moving a venue, you might say that it was reasonable to move to a venue which doesn't have 3 steps up to the door so that somebody in a wheelchair could access your venue. It would not be reasonable to shut your group on one side of town and move it completely to the other side of town because a particular child could access it there, if that meant that the 20 people already attending that group could no longer get there. So there are all sorts of things that we could do that would fundamentally change the nature of that provision that would not really be reasonable. Ignoring the needs of the other children and young people who are already accessing the group would also make it an unreasonable ask. Actually, if a child doesn't want to be part of a group for whatever reason, that encompasses some, loud, noisy running around games. Yes, you might think about how you manage those and how you use the space and how often you do that and whether you do those things only outside where it won't be loud and echoey. But is it at the end of the day reasonable to say we are the Woodcraft group that never runs around because individuals find it difficult if there's lots of noise? Actually, maybe that's something that a lot of people come to the group because they need to access. So not saying don't do that, but there is a balance that needs to be struck between meeting one person's needs or meeting the needs of one group of people at the expense of another. And I suppose the other thing to say is it does not mean holding our group as a voluntary youth organisation to the same standard as a public body. What is reasonable for us, a voluntary youth organisation with limited resources, run on volunteer labour, it is much harder for us to make a major adjustment like, I don't know, refitting refitting our venue that we probably don't own and only rent for 20 quid a week anyway. Whereas to ask a government agency to make sure that its building was as accessible as it could possibly be would be a much more reasonable ask. So we need to remember that the test of reasonableness is also about it being proportional to the resource that's at our disposal. Moving then to thinking about how we understand the needs of the young people and how we make sure that we meet those needs. The obvious place to start is the health and consent forms that we ask parents and carers to fill in to tell us about their child and give us their consent to be part of our group and to be in our care. That's obviously a really important part of understanding what needs are held by the young people in your group. But my experience is that that's only the start. You might get some information about an issue that the young person presents with. You might get a collection of initials, which you then have to go and look up. I've certainly done that before. What then would be really good practice is to then initiate that discussion and say, I've seen you've written this. What does that mean in practice? These are the sorts of things that we're going to do. Are they likely to be an issue? What do you suggest that we do? Depending on the age of the young person, that can happen with just the young person. It can also involve the parent and carer, and I would absolutely involve parents and carers in that. But the child will have will have a good idea of what they want to do, what their aspirations are, as well as what they can do. And I think just checking in with the parent and carer that makes sense. I suppose other things that you can reflect on to get a sense of what support they might need. Do they have additional support at school? That's a good indicator of how a school sees their additional needs. And okay, our provision is different, but actually if you've got a child who is given one-to-one support at school, that's perhaps an indication that they might need to have some additional support beyond just being included in a group. What helps them to deal with the impact of their condition or their impairment or their disability, and what makes it harder? Are there things that we can seek to include more of, to dial up in our provision or in the way that we work as leaders? What makes it harder? I've an example of a child in one of my groups who used 2 hearing aids. So she had fairly serious hearing impairment. Actually, she functioned incredibly well in the group as long as I remembered not to talk with my back to her. But she worked much better in one of the 2 rooms that we had at our disposal than in the other, because it was big and loud and echoey, and she found it much harder to hear what I was saying and what other people were saying when we were in the big echoey hall rather than the small one with the soft furnishings. Those sorts of things that you're only going to get through a dialogue with the young person about the specifics of the group that you're in. And I think also, you will get to know the children in your care over time, and actually as a group of leaders, observing what you see happening in the group and reflect on how successful those activities have been and what's worked and what hasn't, as you would with any other activity that you were doing in any other group, and then reflecting on that as part of your planning and saying, well, actually I can see that when we do activities like this, some of the group really struggle, and maybe we need to think about a different way of managing that transition from a running around game to a sitting down quietly game. Or what could we do differently? Shall we go and find some more games to play with the group, to introduce the group to, that are less focused on running around and more focused on sitting in a circle, but still have that activity level so that this child with a physical impairment can join in fully. Those are the sorts of things that might be worth might be worth reflecting on as part of your planning. So coming to the end of this little section then, I would share some thoughts and top tips about what we can be doing. Be led by the young person. They will have an idea of what works for them and what makes them uncomfortable and what makes them happy. And listening to them is as important as it would be to listen to any other child or young person in our group, because that's what we do. We empower young people. So that's probably where our sense of reasonable adjustment should really start for young people with disabilities. And that's an ongoing conversation. And I think going back to that thought about the GLEESON case, one of the things that we need to be quite clear to parents and carers about in particular is that maybe some of the ways that we work in Woodcraft Folk, particularly in more kind of parent-led groups where there's a large number of people all doing a couple of sessions a term, actually the nature of our provision means that in order to make that reasonable adjustment and make sure it is done consistently so that your child has a consistent experience and is consistently included in the group, we will need to share that among quite a large group of active leaders who also happen to be the parents of the young people involved. It's important to be clear about that, and it's important to have some buy-in and some consent from the child and their parents to make sure that that's something that they're comfortable with. But only by sharing it with all the people that need to know, everybody who's going to be leading a session that term, can you make sure that people are getting a consistent experience which matches up to what they would hope to be providing. It's also really important that we communicate and share that success. Actually, reasonable adjustment should, in an ideal world, not be about one person and one person's needs. It's about making your group inclusive by design and sharing the idea and the impression and the understanding that Woodcraft Folk is an organisation where we respect and celebrate people for who they are, and we are willing to make those adjustments and those amendments and tweaks to what we do. If you are choosing to move your group from one side of town to the other, from an inaccessible venue to an accessible one, say, we have changed our venue with effect from September. It is now much more accessible to people in wheelchairs. It is now easily accessible on public transport, whatever it happens to be. Talk about that and talk about why you've done it, because it sends an important message to people who have never heard of us at the moment, but might be waiting for the organisation that their young person could come and engage with, that's going to take and embrace them for who they are. It's important to factor the adjustments that you make into the risk assessment of the activities that you do. What we are trying to do when we make reasonable adjustment, as when we do everything else, is reduce and manage the risk rather than eliminate it completely. It's important that we reflect on what is risky in our provision, but it's not important that we wrap everybody up in cotton wool and make sure that they are never exposed to anything that could possibly expose them to some risk. That's kind of inherent. It's just making sure that we go into that with our eyes open. And when we're talking about young people with additional needs, whether those are physical, emotional, behavioural or communication needs, it's also really important that we think about the risks that are associated with taking those young people to do an activity for the first time, and that we are doing everything that we can to manage that and reduce the risk, whether that is making sure that we've got information available up front so they know what they're getting exposed to, whether that's making sure that there are suitably qualified adults there in the right ratios. All of those things can help us to make sure that we do it as safely as we possibly can. Finally, I've just got a few resources that I think it would be good to share, and I will put these attach these to the page on the website when we post the recording of this webinar as well. There's lots and lots of guidance on the Equalities and Human Rights Commission website, but there is specifically a resource that I'll link to, which is kind of basically exploring the implications of the whole of the Act for clubs and societies, not specifically for youth organisations, but clubs and societies. So in the sections around proportionality, there are some quite good examples that it might be good to reflect on in terms of what proportional might mean, what a reasonable adjustment might look like, sort of quite rooted in sort of sports and social clubs and things like that. But the examples are still relevant. We have previously had some resources some webinars which were part of an inclusion series, which talk specifically about particular families of disability and impairment. So if you are experiencing working with children with those impairments, those disabilities, it might be a really good idea to go and explore the resources that are already online. There is an excellent one done in partnership with the National Autistic Society around autism and autistic spectrum disorders and what that actually means. There are also resources from the National Deaf Children's Society about working with children with sensory impairment, so that's something to go and explore. There are, in the leader handbooks, there are some inclusion questions, which I think perhaps Lauren will talk about in a moment as well. And these are just a bit of a checklist that you can go through with your own group to just say, are we doing what we can to be inclusive by design, or are there things that we should reflect on and work on together to try and make our group a little bit more open, a bit more inclusive. Specifically, there is an accessibility checklist around the physical accessibility of your venue, which was some work that a group of members worked on a few years ago, but it's incredibly relevant. So actually, if that's a factor for you, if you know that your group's regular meeting venue could be more accessible, that's well worth a look. Talk to other people. There's very little that you're going to come across in your group that no other leader in the whole of Woodcraft Folk has ever come across. And either talking to people in person at regional or national gatherings, or online in spaces like the Woodcraft Facebook page, you can get really good ideas. I recently ran a training event where we just went round and thought amongst the group of people that were there about how we could adapt some of our most popular games to make them a little bit more accessible for a group that have a couple of children who are wheelchair users. And that was a really good 10 minutes of working out what we could do to that group. The ingenuity of leaders and also the ingenuity of children in our groups to adapt things and come up with different ways of doing them is brilliant. There are specialist organisations, some of whom we've got kind of more formal partnerships with, but you can reach out to them. Scope, MenCap, National Deaf Children's Society, National Autistic Society are just some of the examples that come to mind. They could either give you specialist advice or signposting, or they've got resources on the website. Sometimes they'll offer local training sessions, and those are really good to access so that you're skilling yourself up to deal with the particular issues and the particular additional needs that you've got in your group. And there will also be local organisations in your patch that I know absolutely nothing about, whether that's parental support groups or friendship groups or local play schemes or whatever, that you can go and access and get additional insight from, as well as the parents and the young people themselves who live with the effects of the disabilities and the impairments that they are presenting with. And know more about them than anybody. I'll just open it up to see if anyone's got any questions or comments just now, before then handing over to Lauren, who's going to, I think, talk more broadly around the inclusion issue. I'm taking silence to be enthusiastic participation. Are you all still there?
I'm still here.
You're still here. Excellent. Really good. No questions here. No questions from Abigail. That's great. Okay. I'll just stop the recording there. No, I won't. And say I'm now going to hand over to Lauren, who is going to take us through a wider overview of inclusion issues.
Hi everyone, my name's Lauren and I work as a development officer in Cambridgeshire and Bury St Edmunds. And tonight I'm going to be presenting this webinar about inclusion. So this webinar is going to cover a sort of introduction of what Woodcraft Folk says we should be doing as leaders and volunteers, and then talking about including all religions and faiths and beliefs, and also looking at including people with disabilities, which Owen sort of touched upon, but also including people with autism. Then we'll look into including all genders and LGBT inclusion as well. We'll look at some flexible volunteering, and then again, same as Owen, look at some useful resources and support and where that can be found. So a defining feature of Woodcraft Folk provision is that the activities that Woodcraft Folk provides for its young members have many similarities with the provisions offered by other voluntary organisations for children and young people. However, it is expected that a Woodcraft Folk group, regardless of the age group or the nature of the community it serves, will seek to be inclusive of children and young people regardless of ethnicity, faith, gender, sexuality, family circumstances, or any additional needs, which is what we're kind of going to cover those things in this webinar. So again, this is taken from, as Owen mentioned, the inclusion questions document, which there's a link to at the end of the webinar, that as volunteers, ways to put our commitments to inclusion into practice can include working to ensure that the composition of our groups reflect the communities we serve. So looking at the demographic of the area that we live in or the area that the group meet in, and making sure that we reflect that in the members of our group, or try as hard as we can to include those people. Meeting the support requirements of children and young people with additional needs, changing the way that we run a group or an activity to ensure everyone is able to participate, which is kind of going back to Owen's reasonable adjustment. Ensuring that the cost of our activities does not prevent people from participating, which is also another big part of inclusion, making sure that we are communicating and engaging with people from all backgrounds and all circumstances, and trying our hardest to allow them to engage the same as everybody. Leading activities for our young members to explore and challenge stereotypes, and then getting involved in social action projects to address inequality, which I know lots of groups already do. So we're going to start with including all faiths and religions and beliefs. So at our groups, we should seek to widen participation by welcoming all members of the community to join us. So that means contacting all schools and not just looking at maybe where your own child goes to school, but looking at all schools in the area, including faith schools, including schools that might have lower results when it comes to exams, and making sure that we're really getting the word out there, and also, as I said, going to faith schools and making sure that they know that our groups are going on as well. So we also want to be proactively engaging with other organisations, especially voluntary organisations, to make sure that the word is being spread about a group to the whole community. Sometimes other organisations can also help us spread the word by telling their young people about our group, but also about them letting people know who might be interested in coming along to our group. If they have someone in their group who really enjoys the activities that we provide, as well as the activities that that organisation provides, they might be able to come and engage with us. In some areas, we found that translating leaflets to be accessible to everyone has been really useful. I know that that happened in the West Yorkshire project. Lots got translated into Arabic and Urdu and also into Mandarin, because sometimes even if the young person who wants to come to the group speaks really well, really good English because they go to an English school, their parents at home might not speak such good English. So it's really good to be able to translate a leaflet for them, for the parents as well to be able to understand, or grandparents at home to understand what their child wants to go to and what their child's coming along to. So as leaders and volunteers, we can also make sure our programme is inclusive to all faiths and religions and beliefs by celebrating many festivals or significant dates around the world throughout the year. For example, Black History Month, a whole range of different religious festivals from different religions, also looking at LGBT plus months, and also Mental Health Awareness Week and other events that come up throughout the year. So as I mentioned briefly before, representing the demographic of your area within your group. So for example, I live in North London, where we have quite a big demographic of Jewish and Greek families living around, and so we make sure to contact the Greek school that meets on a Saturday morning to let them know about our group as well. So now moving on to including people with disabilities, which is quite a broad heading to have, I know, but because there's a whole range of different disabilities, as Owen said, there can be physical impairment or also a learning difficulty as well. So I'm going to talk about the fact that on the website, and there'll be a link to it at the end as well, that there are activities around disability awareness that can be found. With me. And so that can be, as Owen said, with reasonable adjustment, adapting games or activities to fit in with everybody who comes to your group. Most importantly, I would say, is to ask the young person themselves and their family what they are comfortable with. And as Owen said before, making sure that they are comfortable with what's going on. After all, the young person themselves and their family know best of what is going to work for them and what has worked for them in similar situations, or even what hasn't worked for them in similar situations. As Owen also said, is that we don't need to wait for these people to join our groups. We can look at examples which also can be found on the website, which are activities that look at how it feels to be, for example, blind, to have a hearing impairment, or to be a wheelchair user. And then it's really great to discuss that afterwards, of how the young people felt when they had that impairment put on them, and then how other people might feel to have that all the time. So as I said, games can be adapted to fit in with the group, but if you're doing a running around game like Golden River or something like that, and you do have a wheelchair user, for example, it's important to talk to the whole group and communicate of what risks could be coming. If you got run over by the wheelchair over your toe, that would hurt, and that's something that's perfectly reasonable to talk to the whole group about and to discuss afterwards as well, of what went well and what maybe could be changed for next time. Getting the young people to create their own games where everybody can be involved is also a really good way of including everybody in choices and empowering them of what they would like to do at group night. So including young people with autism, which again Owen sort of touched on before, but it's really important to have a structure for your group night, to keep the young person with autism in question comfortable with what's going on. So if you keep your session structure similar each week, this will avoid causing any confusion or people not knowing what to expect and not knowing what they're used to. This can also be really useful for if you have a parent cooperative or a cooperative of adults who aren't the same leaders every week. It's really great to have a structure so that everybody knows what to expect, not just those young people with autism. So for example, you could start with a circle where everybody says the creed or the envoy and then shares individual news from their week. Then that could move into a game and then onto the main activity, which might be a craft activity or a debating activity, and then always having a closing circle where you might sing Link Your Hands Together, and then going home. If you keep that structure the same or similar, then each week everybody knows what to expect and nobody's surprised or feels uncomfortable if it changes. However, if it does change, if you're going out on a trip or if something different is happening, it's really important to communicate that to people before it happens, especially people who have autism, because it's really important for them to know what they can expect. So planning ahead can really help with this. And so let everybody know, maybe let the families of those children know what is coming for the whole term, so that they can also be talking to their child before the session and when they're on the way to the session of what's going to happen that week. And this will really help their confidence in attending the sessions and help them to know what we're going to be up to. So moving on to including all genders. People who identify as trans might identify as male or female or somewhere in between, or neither of male or female, and they should have the right to be treated as the gender with which they identify, regardless if any medical or legal steps they have taken. If a young person wishes to transition, Woodcraft Folk leaders and volunteers should respect their right to do so and seek to engage them within the group under their gender identity. So this can be, I guess, a bit of a changing time for the young person and also for their place in the group. However, we as leaders and volunteers can make that much easier for them by asking everybody in the group what pronoun they would like to use, and go around in a circle to introduce yourself and which pronoun you feel comfortable with. And also, sorry, I'm just seeing something on the chat. Can you hear me now, Abigail? I hope that everybody can hear me. I'm going to carry on and I'll keep an eye on the chat and see if it comes up again. So yeah, remembering to ask about pronouns and also trying as much as we can to use gender neutral language. For example, the chairperson, and not always assuming, for example, that a doctor or a fireman is male and that a teacher is going to be female. So looking at different ways to, are we back? Looking at different ways to address the, okay, great. Looking at new ways to address the group and not always saying boys and girls or saying guys, or, you know, saying hello everybody can make a whole lot of difference for somebody who is transitioning or is questioning their gender identity. So Rainbow Resources, which is a IFM SEI resource, which again, the link is at the end of the webinar, have a really great resource, which is Rainbow Resources, Sexuality and Gender, and pages 21 to 24 are really important tips for facilitators, not only for, as it says on the screen, when dealing with bullying or discrimination, but also dealing with how to tackle those initial questions of when somebody's questioning their identity, and how we as leaders and volunteers can support the young people within our groups and help them to really feel included at a Woodcraft Folk group, because Woodcraft Folk groups should be a place where young people can be themselves and be empowered to make their own decisions, and also have a group around them who are supporting them. So to carry on that, yeah, we want to make sure that all of our young people are comfortable with our groups, regardless of their gender. And so now we're going to kind of move on to when we're going on a trip or a residential or a camp, which can sometimes be a bit of a tough area for some leaders to deal with. And I know that lots of groups are moving forward with this, but again, with as Owen said, with the reasonable adjustment, you don't need to wait for somebody in your group to be questioning their gender. We can make steps to make sure that all of our young people are comfortable with their sleeping, changing, toilet arrangements whilst we're on on a camp or on a residential or on a trip. So beforehand, it's really important to make sure that we talk about the sleeping arrangements and the changing arrangements. Some groups decide that they're going to put a mixed tent, so have all genders in one tent, and maybe that'll be a big tent. And some groups decide to divide by gender and obviously age into smaller tents. So every group's different, and I think every case will be looked at sort of individually, depending on the children and young people that you have in your group. So yeah, so some choose to have the big mixed tents, but this is something that obviously should be talked about beforehand, and maybe this can be entered on a session that is about camp and giving those young people, again, a bit more empowerment to talk about where they would like to sleep and talk about where they would like to change and what they feel comfortable with, and not just assuming that everybody will be happy to go in together or that everybody will be happy to share with people who have the same body parts as them. It's really important to talk about this and make it more of an open conversation so that everybody can feel comfortable and everybody can communicate where they feel most comfortable. It's important as well to make sure that the site that you're visiting or where you're going for a day out has suitable spaces for changing. I know that a lot of places now will have gender neutral bathroom and changing facilities, but not everywhere does. So it might be worth looking into this a bit more if you're going to somewhere that's not a Woodcraft Folk centre, and so looking into it. I know that at London Camp in the summer, because we had control, let's say, of the whole site, use of the whole site, we could label the bathrooms, changing facilities and showers as we wished at that time. Although I know that in other times they would be just male and female. So make sure that you are in contact with the site beforehand to check that you can either make this reasonable adjustment for yourself or to make a different reasonable adjustment and have other facilities there. So, as I said, there should be a suitable private changing and toilet facilities for all of our young people in our organisation, regardless of their gender or how they identify. That's something that all young people have the right to. So our Woodcraft Folk trans inclusion policy and guidance for leaders can be found following this link, which I'm sure me and Owen can make available on the website as well. And this, going back to the tent sharing and changing facilities, this can be something that can be revisited before every trip. Even if there's no new people coming and it's the same group of people that were on the last camp or residential, they might have changed what they're comfortable with. They might have changed. They might want different adjustments to be made or might want a different circumstance for each trip. So it's really important to just check with the young person. Again, the young people know best about what they feel comfortable with. So moving on to LGBT plus inclusion. Some people might think that talking about LGBT themes and rights and history is something that should be just for the older children. However, one of the questions on the inclusion checklist, which I mentioned before, is do you explore themes of inclusion at your group? So this can be a really good way to explore a theme of inclusion, talking to elfins about different families and how different families are made up. And also having sessions about equality and how people should all be treated the same and how we can ensure that everybody, especially in our group, is treated the same and how our young people can take that outside. So another kind of practical thing is to not always say, tell your mums and dads at home about this, give this letter to your mum and dad, those kinds of things. We can try and say, tell everyone at home about this, tell your people at home, tell everybody that you know. You don't need to sort of be specific about just mum and dad or just parents, because not everybody is in the same boat there. So again, the IFM Rainbow Resources has more great activities around sexuality as well as gender. So that's something to really look at for all age groups. And it says on each activity which age group it's suitable for. So again, every group is different and you can decide what your young people will engage with best, depending on which activity it is. So as mentioned before, with the Rainbow Resources having advice for leaders about stopping discrimination, it's very important for us as leaders to actively stop discrimination or bullying from happening in our groups and pull people up if we overhear somebody saying something which another person in the group or even another person in society might find offensive or might find uncomfortable, and address it as a group. And maybe that means to take on another inclusion activity in the next week, even if that's not planned. So another way that we can look at inclusion is to have flexible volunteering. And what I mean by that is having a wide range of volunteers being included in our groups. For example, including adults from a variety of different backgrounds and circumstances. The same again as representing the demographic of our area. We want to be seeking volunteers from different places. For example, the local volunteer centres, parents of members of our group, even if that's just parents coming in to give one session, for example, somebody coming in to give a session from about their own faith or culture or a religious festival that's coming up. And also looking to other organisations as well to seek out activities that can happen that can make sure that our group is learning about different cultures and different things that go on around the world as well as your local area. What we do at Woodcraft Folk is putting the young people and their experiences first and making sure that they are getting the best experience that they can out of Woodcraft Folk. And this can be really this can be made better by having a whole range of different volunteers, and every volunteer has a different skill to share, and it's really important to have different volunteers coming in and sharing different skills with our young people, and showing the demographic of our areas as well. So here's a list of a few helpful resources, some of which I've pointed out as we've gone along. So for example, the Equal Opportunities Policy, the Disability Awareness Activities for Group Nights, which I spoke about before, the Understanding Autism webinar, which Owen mentioned briefly from the National Autistic Society, the Rainbow Resources Sexuality and Gender online reading, and also the inclusion questions, which we've sort of gone through a little bit, but it's definitely something that I would say each group should look at and try their best to answer those questions and make sure that they are actively doing as much as they can to include as many members of the community that they're in as possible. Are there any questions? I know that Abigail cut out, but I think she's back.
I'll just jump in if I can, Lauren. I think just to reflect on kind of something, things that have come out of that. I think a lot of what we've talked about tonight, both of us, is stuff that is really important when it comes to inclusion, and creating a space that is welcoming to all young people. But much of it is just stuff that we would be aspiring to do anyway. I think it really came to me when you were talking about how we use how we make use of spaces when we go away, so that sleeping arrangements and so on are inclusive of trans young people. The concept of having a conversation with the young people in our groups so that they are comfortable about who they're expected to share a tent or a dormitory with, that's just a no-brainer. That's just what we would hope that we would be doing anyway. And I think that's a really important part of it. Similarly, making sure that we are putting a diverse range of activities about a diverse range of cultures, and that there are a diverse range of volunteers that our young people see. It's just what we'd hope from a Woodcraft group anyway. And I think that's, that for me is one of the threads that comes through this. A lot of it should be, we're not just doing this solely to demonstrate that we are inclusive of particular groups. It's about making our groups the best Woodcraft groups they can be, and therefore making them to some extent inclusive by design. And I think that's where things like reflecting on those self-assessment questions will really help groups have a look at that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, as you say, some of it to most of us should come as almost sort of second nature, common sense sort of thing. But let this webinar and also Owen's part of the webinar be almost just a reminder of, as you say, what we could be reflecting on, what we should be reflecting on, and how we can make sure all of our young people feel comfortable coming to our groups.
Thanks, Lauren. I think that feels like a really good place to end it. If there's no more questions or comments from the floor. Thank you very much for your participation, everyone, and we will have this recording and particularly some of the resources that Lauren and I have mentioned up on the website as soon as we can. Thank you very much. Good night.